So welcome everybody. My name is Michelle Hanlon. I'm the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law and the co-founder and president of Moonkind, the only organization in the world focused on preserving cultural heritage in outer space. I'm delighted to host a panel today, including Dr. Greg Autry and Dr. John Rummel, to talk about moon, exploration of the moon, the ethics of space exploration, space law and preservation, and heritage in space, and any other questions about space law, about returning to the moon that you may have. So we have really informative presentations. I think I'm sort of humbled to be in the presence of these two gentlemen who bring so much knowledge to this topic. And so I'd like to give them a lot of time to talk about what they're doing and what's going on in space. Greg Autry, if you don't know him, is an educator, writer, manager, and tech entrepreneur. He researches and publishes on space commerce, entrepreneurship, technology innovation, and trade policy. He teaches space entrepreneurship for the International Space University and the Commercial Space Studies Graduate Certificate Program at Florida Tech. He previously served as an assistant professor of clinical entrepreneurship with the Marshall School of Business at the University of South Carolina.
Southern California.
Southern California, I'm so sorry. University of Southern California. Where he taught entrepreneurship and technology commercialization courses from 2013 to 2020, stepping down from USC, Southern California, following the White House announcement of the president's intent to nominate him to the position of CFO at NASA. Greg, thank you so much for being with us, and I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is a great conversation point, and thank you for all your work on protecting lunar heritage sites and more. That's something that's super important, and I hope we all agree on. Nobody should disagree on that topic, but it needs to happen. So I've titled my presentation Selling the Moon, and it has a commercial perspective. Happy to get feedback at the end of the session from anybody with a less commercial perspective. I think one amusing thing I'd like to share is when I was on the agency review team at NASA back in 2016, 2017, with a group of great and highly qualified people, Charles Miller and I were kind of viewed as the commercial guys on the team, although I don't really think it's fair to bifurcate it that way. But there were some folks on the team that referred to us as the Ferengi, and I thought that was kind of fun for you Trek fans. All right, so space is a really big business already. You might have been told that. This data from the Space Foundation is commonly shared. You'll see there's numbers suggesting that the global space economy is 300, 400 something billion dollars. To put that in some perspective, though, you might want to compare it to some other things. The app business is smaller than that. So the revenues actually generated from mobile apps are smaller than that. Investments in space are big too, about $6 billion going into space, according to the folks at Space Capital, formerly the Space Angels report. And it's good to point out that their data comes very close to another report from Bryce. They're only off by $100 million. And since I'm going to work for the government, I'd like to point out that that $100 million discrepancy is close enough for private sector work.
So Greg, I just want to step in. We're not seeing your slides. Are you sharing slides right now?
Yeah, I'm going to start over then.
Yeah.
I forgot to click on the share the slides button. Hold on.
There we go. Great.
Now you see my slides. Okay, selling the moon. Okay, so space is big. This is the data from the Space Foundation I mentioned, about $400 billion in global revenues. About $6 billion in investment, according to the Space Angels, Space Capital folks, and Bryce lined up with that. And there's my joke for government employees that's close enough for private sector work. It is really important, though, to see validation from a couple of different sources on this data. But it is worth noting that everything is not always as it seems. It's great throwing out these numbers and showing that the space business, for instance, is bigger than the app business. But the space economy is dominated by what we call consumer services at this time. This isn't a lot of in-space economic activity occurring. This is stuff coming back down to Earth, and a huge, huge chunk of that is radio and TV broadcast down to Earth, where they're counting the entire revenues of that media stream. It's important to realize that value isn't all created by the space part, right? A lot of the value that people pay for when they go to DirecTV is created by the content. And so to some extent, that number is probably a little bit inflated. The chart looks like the investment trend is great, and it is. And I'm really happy to note that although we've gotten a pause from COVID earlier this year, everything I see anecdotally really says that the numbers are picking right back up, and investors remain enthused with the space business. Silicon Valley and international investors, some of whom are good and some whom I think we ought to keep out of our market, are very excited to invest in American and global space startups. So we're looking at about this $26 billion number, but how did it get to $110 billion in the next report? So space capital, space angels folks changed the way they do their accounting, falling a bit in line with what Space Foundation was doing with the revenue numbers. And it's important to see this. So here was the 2019 year-to-date numbers for all of the different categories. And then when we come down in 2020, you'll see this this big chunk, which is the application business. Well, the application business is, again, these consumer services. So they call it positioning, navigation, and timing. If you look, though, that means money that was invested into Uber, Snapchat, and other companies that use GPS is being counted as a space investment. It's a little bit difficult to disentangle what the value of an investment in Uber is as far as space is concerned. But it is important, and while you're out there voting, I want you to hold whomever it is that you choose to vote for or support accountable for space. The returns on space are real. You would not have Uber if you did not have GPS, okay? GPS returns probably $1 trillion to the global economy every year, certainly many times more to the US economy than American taxpayers have paid for all of our space program. Motorola did a study in the trucking industry, and basically it shows about $52 billion a year, and this was 10 years ago, coming into the US economy for the improvements of efficiencies in US trucking fleets, right? That's just trucking. And that is more than the DoD and NASA space budgets combined. So don't let anybody in the political arena tell you that that money is not solving problems here right on Earth. It is every day. But we've also got to realize that if we're counting Pokemon Go as space revenues, we want to understand that. So one of the other things that I think is really important to realize is that economics abhors the vacuum. It's been really hard to get the cislunar space economy going as a separate entity from services delivered back to Earth. Incrementalism, however, has paid off. So Made in Space, for instance, has done a great job of developing technologies that have actual practical applications, for instance, on ISS. And interestingly, their 3D printing that is gravity independent has applications here on Earth. For instance, printing on ships at sea or in submarines is something interesting that they can achieve that doesn't work well with traditional gravity fed systems. SpaceX has done a brilliant job going step by step by step in real businesses that deliver real value to real customers and getting revenues back on their way to Mars, right? So if they said, we're just going to start a program to go to Mars, they would have died 15 years ago. But because they realized that they had to create a business every step of the way in a ladder to get there, it's been working. Now, very often their anchor customer is the United States government, whether that's NASA or DoD or some three-letter agency, but those are real customers who have real needs, and they're fulfilling those needs in a commercial way, and that works. What it turns out doesn't work, again, is these quantum leap programs. So folks that decided they were going to go mine asteroids and didn't have a revenue generating step in between are essentially dead. So I encourage young space entrepreneurs to think hard about what is it that I can do in the next 5 years that will find a real customer that will deliver real revenues. Everything's about customer discovery here. And if you have a vision of 30 years from now sending people to colonize a moon of Saturn, I'm all about that, but don't start with that because investors are getting wise and it won't fly. Earthside Upsides also paid off. So two folks that I am proud to have mentored at the University of Southern California, USC, are Tim Ellis and Jordan Noon, who founded Relativity Space, and they're 3D printing full-scale orbital rockets. They've got a pad at Vandenberg and on the Air Force side at the Cape. They've got a big facility at Stennis with 3 test stands in a 200,000 square foot building that they're refurbing for NASA. This is a great public-private partnership story too, because you get that private money. And I was in that building about a month ago in Mississippi, and it was abandoned years ago by NASA. The roof is leaking. There's lead and asbestos in there, and private money is going to go in and clean up this problem that NASA never got money from Congress to deal with. A lot of these old buildings, have opportunities this way. But the important thing about relativity space is their solutions address real launch problems, people wanting responsive and incremental launch and the flexibility that comes with being able to 3D print the fairing or change the tank size and stuff like that. But they can also print things here on Earth, and they've developed the world's largest metallic printing systems, and their investors know that whether the space business works out or not, that has applications. Now, Tim and Jordan want to print rockets on Mars, right? So that you can build your ascent vehicle on Mars. That is a great long-term vision. But if that was their business plan, they wouldn't have gotten $175 million from investors, and they wouldn't actually be ready to fly soon. Virgin Galactic, same thing. They chose a business that has real customers, and they've sold hundreds of tickets. They could have sold a lot more if they hadn't have stopped pre-selling them. I'm so excited to see that Alan Stern, the PI for the Pluto New Horizons project, has been announced as the first kind of citizen scientist that's going to get to go fly on Virgin. That is fantastic, and I compliment George Whiteside and Mike Moses, everybody at Virgin that made that decision. But they had an IPO, and this is what's really amazing. Here's a space company that goes IPO a year ago, and their stock shoots up. Now, it's been up and down, but it has been strong, and it's been a stock of notable significance in the market, right? For years, I am sure that there were traditional investment advisors and executives at Virgin that probably told Sir Richard Branson not to pour all his money for more than a decade into this crazy space business, right? You know those people. And guess what? This year, how is the rest of Virgin Group doing? Well, they've got an airline, they've got a new cruise ship. How's that working out, right? Turns out not very good. It turns out that Branson was able to sell Virgin Galactic stock after the IPO and essentially bail out the traditional Virgin Group, right? So the airline and the cruise ship company are probably still alive because of the long-term investment that he made in the space business, which I think is about to take off big time. I can tell you I'm saving my pennies. Another topic that I think doesn't get addressed well enough in the cislunar economy, and I keep throwing this out to everybody I talk to that might be an aspiring entrepreneur, is down mass, okay? There's a lot of money going into launch. There's a lot of interesting money going into resource extraction and rovers and landers. I don't hear too many people talking about how to get stuff back. So if we make some interesting things in space, particularly from lunar materials, the DV to get back to Earth and the reentry is a challenge. But I'm convinced that commercial folks that focus on how to do this cheaply and in large quantities will be able to do some amazing economic things to surprise us to get that done, right? You could start with LEO, how to get things back from LEO, right? So we're lucky, frankly, that SpaceX decided to do down mass with with their Dragon capsule because they had an interest in future human spaceflight. That was not a requirement of the COTS program when they did resupply, but it's something they provided. So there is some down mass, but nothing like what we got from the shuttle in the past. We need big down mass. We need it cheap. How do you do that? So people looking at heat shields, people looking at how to land things in the ocean, maybe in cargo pods and recover them. And again, how to get the DV that you need from lunar orbit down to LEO. All of these things are important, but I think there's a real business opportunity in down mass. Also, I think we need to think about doing things a little bit different than that we think about. There are solutions we can provide to the moon, particularly while the United States has the amazing opportunity to participate with a bunch of different countries in Artemis Accords, which were announced officially just a couple of days ago. And so you've got countries like the UK and Italy on board with the US putting real money in. Japan and is putting in $1 billion essentially into investments in the cislunar development, and they're putting that into commercial space. I see the same thing approximately coming from Italy apparently. This is exciting, but how do you as a commercial company participate in that? And so I saw this proposal a while back where somebody was going to build this massive solar array on the moon that girdled the lunar equator, collected power, and beamed it back to Earth, right? I love that, but that's the biggest project in the history of human civilization, and nobody is going to fund that. That is like trillions of dollars. But what could you do with the same idea and flip it around? Let's flip it around. Let's think about something in orbit, for instance, NASA's Lunar Orbital Gateway, which I'm a big advocate of. I know some commercial folks, I think, feel that it was an unnecessary step between the lunar surface and Earth, but I think it provides a huge amount of value in a lot of different ways. One of the things is it's a great communications and equipment platform that you can move around cislunar space. It can go anywhere into a variety of different lunar orbits, from a halo orbit at L1 or L2 to the near rectilinear halo orbit for getting Orion docked and a lander down, because we don't have all the DV that we want out of the Orion system at the moment with the current service module and the upper stage that we have on SLS doesn't do everything that everybody wants, but that solves the problem for there. It also lets us do cool things like generate a lot of solar power and consider beaming it down to small landers or human operations on the moon in areas that need power during the lunar night. This would be a great experiment for somebody to do. And it would be, in the long run, I think, a real lunar business, meaning creating a series of satellites that could sit at the appropriate locations in the sun and beam power down to locations that are not in the sun while there are operations going on there, as opposed to having to take either nuclear to the surface or to go dormant during the 16-day lunar night using radioactive heating as a way to keep your robot alive. For human beings, it's even a more complex system. This is a real serious way to consider doing that. That's a real business. I think you'll find NASA, other organizations might someday need that service, and somebody should be pitching it. The US government gets the private sector solutions, and I think the executive orders that you've seen come out of the White House under the guidance of the National Space Council have been pretty amazing. And it's really important to note that we are looking at NASA participating by buying lunar material that will be collected by a commercial system. This will set a legal precedent to say that a commercial company can in fact extract material and transfer ownership of that material that they have extracted. And I'm excited to see that happening. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every slide that I put together about how the US government gets it, but I do want to point out that it's broadly across the government, and we're in a really golden age here where the Department of Commerce gets it. Secretary of Commerce shows up at Space Symposium and talks about space for an hour. That is a rarity we haven't seen in a while. The DoD gets it. The Exim Bank is even on board with finding ways to make sure that developing nations can afford to buy US technologies based on space. The Department of Transportation, FAAST, I serve on the ComStack there. Amazing things are happening. They just released the new launch and reentry rules. We're working on new guidelines for human spaceflight safety standards that will be hopefully adopted on a voluntary basis while there's a moratorium on regulation there. The UK government, Japan gets it. It's a great time to be in space. So with that said, I'd like to just take a pause and take any questions. Are you muted, Michelle? Michelle, you're muted.
Sorry, I was just saying, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or throw it in the chat.
Michelle, do you have any questions while we're waiting?
I was gonna say, I was at Stennis recently, and the work that Relativity Space is doing there is really remarkable. And I think it's a great model. I wish it's something we could publicize more in terms of that public-private partnership. And that way the government can work together, not just to, to actually make space something that's not just sort of a taxpayer burden. But I think, so that I wanted to comment on that. I mean, I'm going to talk a lot about the Artemis Accords myself, and also about this purchase of the regolith by the U.S. government. I think I'm in agreement wholeheartely with everything you've said about the economy, and I couldn't agree more. As a space lawyer, this is the most exciting time to be, alive, right? Because it's just, we're right on this cusp, and we are, we are forming the future. And I think, thank goodness for people like you. I will say, my temperance is sort of the management of, we do have incredible opportunities, but we don't want to, we need to have a little bit of care, and that doesn't mean a lot of regulation. It just means, let's manage our exploration properly. And I think we're in a great position to do that.
Yeah, I honestly think that when you look at who is developing, for instance, the executive orders and the space policy directives, you look at the team that Scott Pace has put together at the National Space Council. You look at the work that Jim Bridenstine and Mike Gold are doing at NASA. You look at Kevin O'Connell and Office of Space Control. These are intelligent, well-informed, dedicated people with years of experience who are making a very professional effort to see that we get economic development, but they're certainly aware of the fact that this needs to be done responsibly and in a way that is appealing on a global level. And I think that the positive response we've seen from the Artemis Accords just completely backs that up. Some of the countries that you might have expected to make an objection at least have not done so. And the folks that are coming on board to some extent are surprising. I do see a question about any predictions for short-term repercussions. So yeah, there's always going to be somebody who might complain, and that might be a country that doesn't have the revenues now to do what it thinks it ought to be doing with its previous space heritage. And I don't think that complaint would be out of any practical concern. There are those who would like to keep the solar system pristine as some sort of national park, the Arctic Wildlife Reserve or something. But the point is, there's no wildlife that we know of. Okay, it's highly unlikely that there's anything living on the moon in particular. So if I have the choice of tearing up the Brazilian rainforest, or parts of Bolivia to get lithium, or ripping Africa apart to get cobalt, or I could do it on the moon by finding an asteroid core in the bottom of a lifeless crater, I'm all about the moon, okay? That doesn't mean that we want to mess with heritage sites, as noted, and we do need to make sure that we get all the science that we want to get done. But once we can commercially go to a location, we're going to get so much more science done. So, I'm not too worried about the objections in the long run, I do think you'll see the usual jerk-knee reaction, short round of people who don't get the benefits to humanity of the long-term solution. But you've got powerful people on our side, like Jeff Bezos, who knows getting millions of people off of the earth and moving extractive industries and moving polluting industry off the earth is by far the best way to do a good thing for Earth. And it doesn't mean we're going to despoil the solar system, but thank God there's no indigenous peoples whose rights are going to be trampled. We certainly have to worry when we go to icy moons or the surface of Mars that there might be biological systems that we want to be able to study and not decimate, but that doesn't mean we can't go there. Anyway.
I'm just pointing out there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A actually, rather than the chat, which I hadn't seen before, but I want you to continue with your presentation, but I think it's interesting, and we would love to know if you agree with Neil deGrasse Tyson that the first trillionaire will be from space mining.
Wow. It depends on inflation. Right now, because of the COVID situation, every country in the world is doing so much quantitative easing, as we call it, printing so much money, the value of currency is falling. So I think we're going to see a billionaire within 5 years, or a trillionaire within 5 years, just because the value of the dollar to some extent may fall. That's entirely possible. That said, I do think a vast fortune will be made there at some point soon. But there's a lot of money to be made. I'm not focused on the trillionaire. I'm interested in all the new millionaires and 100 millionaires that are going to be made in the next few years off the cislunar economy. That's much more important to me.
I think there are a few more questions. I wonder if maybe the rest of your presentation might answer some of them, or you want to go through these now?
Yeah, I don't want to take up the time for the whole session, but yeah. So Kristen Miller asked about NASA's announcement regarding Gateway. Is that a still viable option? Yeah, Gateway, like I said, has a whole bunch of different reasons for existing, right? And it's important for the commercial folks to realize it's already clear that the first couple of segments, the PPE and the minimal habitat, will be launched on commercial launches. There's a commercial resupply contract signed with SpaceX, and personally, I think there needs to be 2 companies in that solution, just like there are in COTS. Because if you're going to have sustainable development that far away from Earth, and you're going to put people in that situation for long-term stays or potentially permanently, you have got to have redundant transportation and supply systems. It's not safe to do it otherwise. If the space station didn't have at least 2 different US vendors plus the Russians, we probably would have had to abandon it when the shuttle shut down. The Russians had problems. SpaceX was there to fill in. Northrop Grumman was there to fill in. When the Antares blew up in 2014, SpaceX continued to deliver. When SpaceX had a failure of the Falcon in 2015, they managed to put the Cygnus on a ULA rocket. Because we have this livery of great space hardware, we were able to keep our $130 billion space station going. Same thing on the moon. So Gateway is part of that multi-approach solution. There's not just one solution. If you're a fanboy of Rocket X, that's great, but we need Rocket X, Y, and Z to get this job done in multiple landers. So I'm excited about the way that NASA said you can go direct to the surface, you can go to the Gateway. They took 3 totally different human lander system proposals that have completely different technological approaches and economic viability, and I love that approach. I know Gateway, I think, is critical. As I mentioned, it's a great platform for comm science and a lot of other things, and having a place that you can get to nearby to the moon has important advantages. And don't forget that it can move, so it can drop into low lunar orbit and do a lot of other things that can be useful.
Yeah, well, I didn't realize the time. I think we could listen and talk about the economics and forever. But I think
let's move on, and I see the questions from Michael Lane and others. We'll get to them.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit now. Go to Dr. Rummel about the ethics of space exploration. There's so much excitement about what's going on. What do we need to think about as we sort of continue to explore space? And I'll just briefly, Dr. Rummel, for those of you who don't know, is a principal partner with Friday Harbor Partners. He was formerly with the SETI Institute and was a visiting scholar at McGill's University McGill University's Institute of Air and Space Law in Montreal, also one of my alma maters. He is a retired professor of biology with East Carolina University in North Carolina, not North California. Dr. Rummel is also the former and founding chair of COSPAR's panel on planetary protection and is the representative on the COSPAR Council for the International Union of Biological Sciences. Dr. Rummel, you have a much larger bio than that, but I'm really anxious to hear what you're saying. So I encourage everybody to go on the website and take a look at his bio, but needless to say, among many other things, he's a holder of 8 NASA Group Achievement Awards, and he has spent a lot of time on planetary protection, including being NASA's Planetary Protection Officer. And so we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, well, I hope that I'm coming through well enough. And I certainly would like to trade some ideas about the gateway at different levels at some point in time myself. So I won't take too much time along this line. But let's see if I can get these to advance. The ideas associated with ethics in space are not new, of course, and even to adopt them to space was done by Gene Hargrove and a bunch of co-authors back in 1987. The moral status of the environment, the things that ethicists talk about in terms of how you can fit in environmental ethics in space and whether it makes sense to do that. Those are things that have been long published and discussed. So I don't claim to be an ethicist, but I do claim to have an interest in outer space and all the things that Greg was talking about. I'm very much a proponent of moving humans into outer space. I'd like it to be live humans, and I'd like them to not make mistakes that they'll later regret. And that's basically where I come down in the ethical dimensions. I mean, most of outer space is inanimate, so we don't worry about inanimate objects particularly, unless you drop one on somebody's house, in which case they object. Ecosystems, rocks, rivers, special places, there are scientific value propositions out there for everything that you can imagine in outer space, and many things that we no longer or haven't yet learned to imagine. Lindy Elkins is talking about the Psyche mission, for example. There's a big question as to whether or not it's incredibly valuable or just valuable. But it's certainly valuable to discovery and to find out more about what's going on in the solar system. We talked a little bit about asteroid mining. This is a former deep space industries view. And here's your, asteroid being turned into a space station, and we can all go back to 2001, A Space Oddity, and say, yeah, I remember that space station. That was a good one. It had artificial gravity, which is one thing that the Gateway doesn't have, and maybe should. But the kind of questions from the public about space ethics, is, can they do that? Who owns outer space? The issue that comes up every time you talk about the Outer Space Treaty. What are the ethics involved, and what will it cost the rest of us? Because none of the things that people are proposing to do in outer space are necessarily obvious investments in the future, and they have to be defended in the face of other needs, et cetera. And should governments impose environmental regulations on commercial space companies? And are those companies otherwise going to drop that something on their house? So people worry about that. And one of the things that I'll put forward is that, yes, governments should impose environmental regulations on commercial space companies as well as on themselves, not so much that you want to stop things from happening, but because they need the support of somebody who's thinking outside of their particular box. You don't want to be into a situation where all the decisions made on environments in outer space are actually being made by investors who are suing the company to do things that they don't think are proper. And so there's a certain amount of governmental responsibility when you're looking at something as big as our solar system or beyond, that governments, in fact, have an interest. NASA's issues associated with going to Mars, for example, was alluded to by Greg. I mean, you might, if there's life there, you want to study it. On the flip side, if there is life there and you don't know about it, you may find yourself in jeopardy in a number of different ways if you do that. And I don't think that that's a good idea for most of the people that I can think of. So we'll see how that goes. One of the problems we have when we look at space resource extraction is the terrestrial experience is not good. It's a regular case that there are terrestrial firms that are being held to a standard that at the beginning looks really positive, et cetera, and at the end, there's a tailing pond wiping out somebody's river. And that happens all the time. There is not, in fact, a really good track record. It's very spotty at best. And of course, we have things like Rio Tinto blowing up a 40,000-year repository of human civilization, which is probably not a good thing either. So here's Rio Tinto. They say all the right words. I won't go over these if these slides are available, but basically their point is that they follow regulations and their environmental requirements are set by regulators. And they don't have them necessarily on their own. And this is a mangrove forest after Rio Tinto has been done with it. It's not quite yet a great mangrove forest. We have Freeport McMoran, sustainability, and basically they follow regulations as well because they're not going to go beyond that. Their shareholders won't put up with it. You end up with a beautiful jungle environment that's been mined, looks like that. On the other hand, you have companies like Potash Corporation, which has got a very large mine, potash mine down in North Carolina. They actually go beyond what they might have to do in this day and age. But when they set it up in the first place, they provided a very good monitoring program to make sure that the local environment did not actually get trashed when they were actually building this mine in the first place. So those are the sorts of things that resource extraction is done on Earth. And a lot of people are skeptical about promises made elsewhere. Now, what do we need to do? This is where you go to a place like the moon, and you realize that models of large landers on the moon actually blast off enough rock that some of it will actually go circle the moon and come back and be a hazard to the lander that just landed. The moon is not anybody's backyard, and it will have different requirements and different things, and ethical issues associated with something like the narrow precautionary principle would have to get very, very carefully looked at because there are things that may or may not happen, may or may not be bad, but may or may not be advisable. So you take a look at something like lunar polar mines. I'd love to go there, get water, extract the water into rocket fuel, and go ahead and have a base from which you can continue to explore the moon or go elsewhere. But 5% of all asteroid and cometary volatiles are things like cyanide or hydrogen sulfide. You've got to be very careful about using those kinds of fuels in an environment that includes humans and not acknowledging that and not putting that into the mix is, I think, an ethical breach. So the kinds of ethical issues that people look at, how wide should the precautionary principle be? Future human beings are going to be hurt by something that we do now. If you drill into an aquifer on Mars and put Earth microbes in it, is it going to preserve the aquifer, or is it going to mineralize it and make it unavailable for future exploration and habitation? And I'd love to see that aquifer used appropriately. I can't tell you what that is, but I can tell you that inadvertent mineralization of an aquifer is not something anybody wants to do at this stage of our development off planet. So those sorts of questions that people have, where does the human ecosystem begin and end? And how much do we have to know before we let humans go beyond Earth orbit and be exposed to planetary environments? if that same aquifer had Mars organisms in it, you wouldn't necessarily want to find that out only after there's some kind of inadvertent or unplanned growth within a space habitat. Now, it has been mentioned that planetary park system is one way to go around that and find places that are worth preserving, but aren't necessarily ripe for development. And those are the sorts of things that we might look at. Those sorts of questions can be answered scientifically. They can be answered for resource prospectors. They can, if Elon Musk is successful and ends up starting an off-space colony, you want to make sure that you don't end up having things brought to that same place that might kill off its food production system, for example. So how do you make sure that the kind of development that goes on is the kind that's sustainable and in fact could lead to a second civilization in this solar system? COSPAR is one such organization that can actually provide the kind of information that people might want. COSPAR is focused most of its concerns on planetary protection, planetary quarantine, protecting against inadvertent contamination of other worlds, and also making it safe to bring things back, a way to judge that. And more recently, they put together a panel on exploration. The first chair was Pascal Hanlon, now it's Francis Westphal, but looking at how to safeguard potential scientific assets of solar system objects, and read that those scientific assets are also regular assets and can be monetized as well. Athena Kustenis is the current panel on planetary protection chair, and she's taken over from Gerhard Kaminik, who took over from me, and essentially looking at how to avoid harmful contamination. But I will point out that nowhere in the COSPAR, NASA's implementation of the COSPAR guidelines are the words harmful contamination found or never were. It was the Space Act that was the basis of NASA's activity. In 2010, we had a workshop on ethical consideration for planetary protection. And the net effect of this was to go ahead and advocate splitting off COSPAR's interest in scientific structures, et cetera, and separate it from the ongoing planetary quarantine activities and use the panel on exploration to identify both resources as well as potential hazards and how to preserve those sorts of things. So if COSPAR or something like it could provide the right kind of input to a commercial organization, for example, you'll find that some items need protection, but everything else is usable. And COSPAR has a category in planetary protection called Category 2, which is basically do whatever you want, just tell me what you did. And that's the way COSPAR's planetary protection policy is worked. The basic aegis of this policy in COSPAR, as opposed to NASA, was something like the War of the Worlds. People concerned about Earth microbes trampling over the Martians or vice versa. And the general agreement among spacefaring nations that interplanetary contamination should be avoided. So we avoid forward contamination and don't discover life that we brought with us. Pretty expensive way to fool yourself. Avoid backward contamination, don't contaminate the Earth, we like it here. And tailor requirements by target location and mission type. So that apparently is more scary than it should be, but it shouldn't be. This was from the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act of 2017, where it specifically outlined that guidelines promulgated by the Committee on Space Research may not be considered international obligations of the United States. No one ever actually advocated that they were, so it was interesting to find out that they shouldn't be. But there are lots of things that shouldn't be considered international obligations of the United States, and not just COSPAR guidelines on planetary protection. UN COPIUS, however, in kind of to balance it off, did point out that the longstanding role of Coast Guard in maintaining the planetary protection policy as a reference standard for spacefaring nations and in guiding compliance with Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty was a good thing. So that's kind of where we are on the ethical standpoint. We have some ways to deal with these things. We have mechanisms that could be put into place to support industrial development at outer space and to provide guidance in terms of what is a good idea and what's a bad idea in terms of developing outer space. There are a number of things that we could go into that are probably bad ideas, but I can only think of all the ones I've run into in my life. An International Space Station that wasn't supposed to vent anything turns out to be one that has parts of the life support system that need to be replaced every 3 weeks. You have to worry about a gateway because we don't have a life support system that goes into it, nor a radiation protection that allows you to deal with it. But if you worry about microbes, go brush your teeth and wash your hands. If we find something else in a place like Mars, then we may actually uncork things that are even better than residue. So the implications of the policy, not to worry, most of the solar system, there are no obvious conflicts between the Coast Guard policy and what people want to do. Only record keeping is required, although NASA seems to have decided to get in the middle of that in kind of a confused way, as well as preserving our lunar heritage. And for the foreseeable future, planetary protection conflicts and robotic missions as precursors for human activities in and around Mars. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Do we have any questions for John? We can throw in the Q&A or the chat. I really appreciate your concept that we really don't have anything to worry about right now from a planetary protection standpoint. Do you think, like, what would you want to see on, or what would we see on Mars that would make you sort of raise a red flag and say, okay, wait, put the brakes on?
Well, I think that the brakes aren't being advocated because people aren't going to Mars right now. You can imagine if you were going to send humans to Mars, we're talking some kind of tourist element that would make it potentially profitable. I can't imagine taking the kind of people who are my age and might have enough money to go ahead and scrape together for a trip to Mars and give them microgravity for 5 months on the way out and 5 months on the way back. And then having somebody allege that whatever it is that made them sick must be a Mars organism. So, false positives are one of the things that I worry about more in terms of development of a place like Mars with humans. I think that we can either contain or understand development and microbial contamination in a positive way if we know enough. And the moon is one place to learn more about that. There's certainly at the Apollo sites places that I would like to go, and with co-authors Danny Glavin and others at Goddard Space Flight Center have advocated going. I'd love to know whether you can detect organic materials underneath Alan Shepard's golf ball. It's not that far away, but we could do that. But there are a number of things that we could learn about terrestrial organisms and their ability to contaminate before we actually stick them into that aquifer on Mars. And I do talk about this mineralization because it's an ongoing problem in aquifers in eastern North Carolina and places like that where they do aquifer storage of water. They always treat the water before they put it down because they don't get the water back otherwise. You have a number of ways that if you were to have this habitat on Mars, what would the people do? Because we're not investing enough money in Mars life support systems to guarantee that they could have fresh food and water when they head back the other way and the tourist activity is over. And, are they going to go around in hamster balls? which were, used in Andy Ware's most recent, somewhat flawed book. Flawed because the atmosphere, you can't have 1/5 of an atmosphere and actually breathe. But anyway, the hamster balls are a good thing. Going on bus trips are another. But if you take somebody who's 65 years old and give them 140 kilograms to trace around in an EVA suit, they're probably not going to thank you when it's all over. And I don't want to see anybody bring up crop diseases either. If you're going to have a nice controlled ecological life support system, which is where I came in way back when after Stanford, you want to make sure that those crops are going to be healthy and that they contribute clean air and food and water to the system. And somebody letting go a cockroach becomes a whole different level of concern at that point.
Or tardigrade for that matter, right? So.
Now, tardigrades they're cute and they're fuzzy, but they're not dangerous. And unfortunately, I feel more for the tardigrades that are waiting on the moon for their release than I feel about anything else. But as a paperwork drill, it shows you the kind of pitfalls you can run into, where people decide that, they're more important than anybody else in terms of these kinds of distinctions.
Yeah.
We still, the Navajo Nation was totally against putting Gene Shoemaker's ashes on the moon. How much does that affect the rest of us and Bill and Porta? I don't know. But I mean, there are ways that people can have these reasonable discussions and reasonable propitiations if necessary.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is the reasonable. And I mean, that's something that I deal with all the time, talking to students and thinking, because, we're thinking about human communities on the moon and what would they look like and what kind of laws, what kind of values would they have. And there are a lot of very diverse values here on Earth. And, I have some views about which values I want to see being thrown out into the solar system with humans. But certainly there are a lot of other, indigenous cultures, non-Western cultures where what are we making value decisions where we shouldn't be at that point? And that's just sort of one of the things that we talk about in class when we talk about human communities. I see that there's a question up in the Q&A, but we only have about 20 minutes left, a little bit less, and so I want to just go through quickly my slides. I'm looking. I just want to do that because I'm looking at the law particularly, and I think that would round out this session really well. I will be very quick. Let's see. All right. So, about me, what we're talking about, and I'm going to bring in the Artemis Accords, which Greg touched on very, very briefly, and this concept that John touched on of, who owns space. And so we do have a treaty regime. We do have outer space law, but it has a lot of gaps in it. So the Outer Space Treaty is considered the Magna Carta of space. Its progeny, the Liability Convention, Registration Convention, and Rescue and Return Agreement sort of expand on ideas that were created in the Outer Space Treaty. The Moon Agreement is a fifth agreement that only 18 nations have ratified. So, and this past April, I think, the United States issued an executive order which definitively said we are not going to ratify the Moon Agreement, and we do not believe any of the tenets of the Moon Agreement are customary international law, and we would not be bound by any of the concepts in the Moon Agreement. So going back quickly to the Outer Space Treaty, it encompasses this concept that space is the province of all humankind, and it's very important to think about that doesn't mean space is a global commons. That means space is available to all of humankind. It shall be free for exploration and use by all states, and there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. So you're thinking, okay, how are we going to see Greg's vision of bringing, having civilizations, people mining on the moon, when everybody has to have free access to everything in space? Articles 2 through 5 sort of don't touch on that in particular, but Article 2 does say there shall be no national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. That means no state, no country can go to the moon or an asteroid and claim it as part of that country. And this has caused a lot of, there's a lot of different interpretations. There's actually two main interpretations of this Article 2. One is, okay, you're saying nations can't claim a territory. That doesn't necessarily mean nations can't extract the resources. And similarly, this talks about national appropriation. It doesn't talk about private or commercial appropriation. And so can a commercial entity say, I'm going to use this territory? What we have in the United States is now, as well as Luxembourg and UAE and perhaps soon to be Japan, is this concept where we have a national law that says we interpret this article of the Outer Space Treaty to say that if you extract resources from any celestial bodies or the moon, you may utilize those resources for your own personal uses or personal gain. Article 3 says international law applies in space. Article 4 says space shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. And Article 5 says astronauts are envoys of all humankind. Article 6 is a very important one because it says nations bear international responsibility for the national activities of their people. So this is how commercial entities are actually brought into the Outer Space Treaty. So the Outer Space Treaty does not apply to commercial entities, but the United States has an obligation as a signatory of the Outer Space Treaty to license and actively watch over and make sure our nationals aren't violating the Outer Space Treaty. So this is the authorize and continue to supervise non-governmental activities. I show the tardigrade. We mentioned it briefly because there was a launch by an Israeli company using a United States launch service provider licensed by the FAA, which launched these tardigrades and some DNA to the moon without informing the United States or any of those licensing regulators that they were doing so. As John noted, you know, the tardigrades are mostly harmless, to paraphrase their Hitchhiker's Guide. But the fact is that those slipped by onto the moon, and so the question of authorization and supervision is of real concern. Article 7 says if you send an object into space and it damages somebody else's object, you're liable. Article 8 says if you send an object to the moon or any place in space, you don't lose ownership of that object. You always have jurisdiction and control of that object. Article 9 is what tempers the concept of the, space is for everyone, space is for all, freedom of exploration. That's countered by this or sort of tempered by Article 9, which says you must have due regard to the corresponding interests of all other states. And it also states that you have to, if you anticipate that your activity will cause harmful interference with somebody else's activity, then you must have a consultation. I always use this due regard slide because, in sort of non-legalese, due regard means, respect, politeness, courtesy, right? But in legalese, it's this huge balance. You're looking at different things. So everything, when you think about what does due regard mean, it's really the biggest gap in the Outer Space Treaty because we are supposed to have freedom of exploration, but we have to have due regard. We don't really know what due regard means. And that's really important when we're talking about creating scientific exploration, mining operations, commercial operations, especially when, we're talking, John noted, when you land on the moon, you can kick up enough regolith to damage your own equipment. So what does that mean about damaging other people's equipment? Article 9 is the harmful interference. This slide just shows you how Surveyor 3 Apollo 12 landed just 300 yards from Surveyor 3. And its landing caused a lot of, the pitting and in Surveyor 3. We know that because the Apollo 12 astronauts brought pieces of Surveyor 3 back, and our scientists were able to say, oh, this definitely happened from that landing. So we understand that the regolith is really abrasive. I talked about the Moon Agreement. It does have this concept of common heritage. But again, the Moon Agreement is not it's only ratified by 18 nations, and the United States in particular has said it will not consider any portions of the Moon Agreement to be customary international law. In US law, Luxembourg and UAE, as I noted, we do have this concept that if you mine it, you own it. This was the executive order that countered the Moon Agreement. The next 10 slides are of Artemis. I think it's important to go through them because it's sort of the next step in space law, in international space law. It's really important to note that these Artemis Accords were first introduced in May. This week, they revealed 7 signatories, but these are not binding international treaties. These are not making international law. They continue to be, think of them as, sort of really giant memorandums of understanding. First of all, they're signed by space agencies, not by the heads of state. And all the language in them is about committing to do things and working to do things and seeking to assure things. So it's the other thing to remember about them is there's nothing new in these Artemis Accords. There's a lot of press about, Russia doesn't like them, China doesn't like them. The fact of the matter is that they basically reiterate the Outer Space Treaty. So we're peaceful purposes from Article 4, transparency from Article 11, interoperability is not in the Outer Space Treaty, but who doesn't think it makes common sense that we should have interoperability of systems in space? Emergency assistance is Article 5, registration of space objects, Article 7, release of scientific data, Article 1, protecting heritage, that is brand new, and For All Moonkind takes complete credit for it, or well, not complete, but we have been a squeaky wheel about protecting heritage. And I was asked the other day, why is that important? Why are we worried about protecting heritage? Because heritage is what makes us what humans. It's what makes us a community of people. It makes us a human species. When I look at this picture, I don't see just an American achievement. This human could not have made it to the moon unless we had our common ancestor from 3 million years ago step up and stand on 2 feet so that you could free your hands to make the tools which then we were used to, understand math and mathematical relationships. We have bones from Ghana and with markings. And so we don't get to the moon without math. We have glass from Mesopotamia. We don't get to the moon without glass. We have astronomical research and analysis from Galileo, from astronomers in China, from astronomers in Mexico. We don't get to the moon without that. So this is the crowning achievement of all of humanity. This is humanity's greatest technological achievement, perhaps greatest achievement, and it could not have been done without our entire history. So this is a culmination of the human species. That's why it's important to protect this heritage. And it's not just the Apollo sites. There are, the first hard landing on the moon was a Russian spacecraft, Luna 2. The first soft landing was also a Russian spacecraft, Luna 9. The first wheels on the moon were actually also Russian. So these are all really important milestones that we need to protect. And I'm running out of time, so of course, space resources is the new thing about Artemis. And these are, again, sort of common sense. A lot of people have raised concerns about what does it mean? Why do we need safety zones? Again, it's common sense. And our organization, For All Moonkind, believes if we start with the preservation of historic heritage, then we can ease into this concept of safety zones that will help us and help our commercial entities build the safety zones they need to actually mine or to actually, do the scientific experiments. Everybody on Earth, we have the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, people on Earth understand that it's important to protect heritage. And so if we can start this concept of safety zone protection and building protections and understanding what due regard means around the concept of heritage, which is something we all agree on, then we can in turn use that and spread that out and broaden that to encompass commercial activities and so forth. And when we talk about preserving historic sites, you know, we are also encompassing what John was saying about environmental site, about parks. You know, this is a management scheme. This isn't a scheme to, you know, stop development of the moon. Absolutely not. We are 100%, 180% for the development of the moon. I want my children to live on the moon, grandchildren probably. But this is about taking the lessons we've learned on Earth and implementing them now, so that we don't have to find, 3 million years from now, we don't want somebody to uncover Neil Armstrong's boot print and say, gee, I think this might have been the first boot print, the way we are with those footprints in Tanzania, which are behind me. No, we want to preserve that boot print so that everybody who goes from the moon and beyond can be inspired by it and can look at that lem and think, wow, at one point in time, we actually put 3 humans in this tin can and sent it into space. We're really an amazing and incredible species. So on that note, I think I've run out of time, and I will stop sharing and see if we have any questions on any of those topics. Can the speakers share their slides? I'm happy to share my slides. I don't know, Greg and John, if you would want to do that.
I have to look through mine to make sure there's no copyright violations or anything I'm not allowed to send out, but I'll send an edited version if there is, but it's probably fine.
Great. Yeah, we'll work with the organizers to do that. John, what was that?
I think that under fair use, it will be okay.
Okay, great. Any other questions or comments? Or there's a lot of information in an hour.
If I might add something to your statements, Michelle, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the Outer Space Treaty is adapted in the real world to commercial activity. It's not as clean as simply saying states are responsible for commercial actors, right? As you noted, it was an Israeli company on a U.S. flight that sent the Terragits, which I don't think is a big deal when you realize that there are kilograms of human waste sitting on the moon full of all sorts of microbes. But the point is, what country is somebody really from is not as clear. You look at a company, say Apple Computer, and you say that's an American company, right? But their headquarters is in Ireland so that they can avoid US taxes. They keep their money in banks in the Caribbean, and they do all their manufacturing in China. So is that really an American company? Should the American taxpayer be 100% responsible for some activity Apple Computer did in space in the future? I don't think so as an American taxpayer, right? So this is going to be interesting, and there are going to be commercial and private individual actors who do not wish to be part of any particular nation. Then the next thing is, okay, so the US or Russia or whoever is responsible for this actor doing something on the moon, but who has the actual right to enforce the law? Because one of the things the Outer Space Treaty sets up is you can't have a territorial claim, which from a kumbaya sort of standpoint sounds great, no borders. But for the reality is, when you don't have borders and territory, you have no legal responsibility to enforce the rule of law within that territory. So there's no police, right? And eventually we're going to have to actually fund the moon police, and we're going to have to figure out who they are and what they're authorized to do so that you can enforce law kinetically when people refuse to simply obey on Earth. The Outer Space Treaty was done at a time when the assumptions were everything would be state controlled, and states controlled their entities. There was pre-globalism, and it also assumed that there would be a way to enforce economically against any company that did something naughty in space, right? You could be sure that Boeing, Lockheed were going to follow the law, right? The United States government had leverage on them if they didn't. But company ABC, you've never heard of, that sends up their own lunar rover, maybe not.
Company ABC is probably going to have the most expensive rent-a-cops you've ever seen out there when they go around to it. If there's somebody else in the neighborhood, then you can certainly envision that there would be a hireable group of people who would like to help out.
Yeah, we do not want the Wild West out there. It may honestly be better to have territories that are governed by some governmental agency, whether that's an Earth government or a new entity in space at some point.
Yeah, and if it's the Pinkertons, who do they respond to?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that's why I'm really enthused by the Artemis Accords, because I think it's a real effort to sort of jumpstart this discussion. And I know people sort of grumble that it should be through the COPOLIS, but because of COVID, the COPOLIS hasn't been able to meet. And there are other issues, obviously, with UN governance, international community that we don't want to go into at this point. But the fact is the United States has been very transparent about the Artemis Accords and what they do. And there are plenty of opportunities for countries to get involved and negotiate those. And so hopefully the more and more countries will get involved with Artemis, and that will serve as sort of a foundation for this next level of space law.
Yeah, I'd love to see the Artemis Accords extended by one particular factor, which is addressing the issue of harmful contamination. It doesn't right now. It's low-hanging fruit, and it's an easy way for the U.S. to show leadership and to maintain the reins of how that discussion goes. And as it is right now, that discussion will happen outside of the Artemis Accords, and I think that we may regret that.
Good point.
I think that's a good addition, John, but I am really excited with what's been done so far. It's been great work.
Yeah, no, I like the way it's going.
Thank you so much. I'm told we are done. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Autry, Dr. Rummel. This is a fantastic. I know it's going to be recorded, and I anticipate having a lot of further discussion on these topics. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.